increased during the passage of time, as always the case. Today, it's a very important occasion. We have another distinguished lecture in our global political economy class. A fortnight ago, we had the rector of Turin University. He was talking about the legal aspect and the way the international financial institution has basically been struggling with changes in their laws and regulatory regimes. Today, we have amongst us Mr. Nandan Unnikrisnan. He has been an expert on the post-Soviet area in former Soviet Union. He used to spend a lot of time. He has been an esteemed journalist and a senior vice president of Observer Research Foundation, which doesn't really require a big introduction back in India, being the preeminent think tank that institution is. Mr. Unnikrisnan does wear many a cap or hat, as you say that, with his academic astuteness, brevity, sharp, witty answers that you would find in his response, and strong insight about the subject that concerns about South Asia, in particular about India and the present engagement of Indian state in the framework of BRICS and whatnot. So let's give a warm welcome to Mr. Nandan Unnikrisnan in our class.
Hi, is this on?
Yes, you need to just switch on, sir. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that works. Thank you, Sanjay, for the kind words. You can all rest assured that most of them are untrue, so don't take them too seriously. I am planning to, originally that's what the plan was, that I would speak to you about India's developmental challenges and how this impacts upon Indian foreign policy. Development challenges would encompass some of the economic challenges, which are primarily economic, and then we would possibly could talk about the emerging new world and how at least India plans to adjust itself or thinks it can adjust to it. I have to, at the outset, confess that probably part of an unhealthy leftover from my days as a journalist, I have complete inability to speak for more than 30-40 minutes. So I will try and stretch this as much as possible, but I would much rather prefer and enjoy if we have an interaction with whatever questions you have. I would be happy to answer them. As Sanjay pointed out, international relations and in general, in specific things about India, maybe about Russia, would be amongst the areas of so-called expertise. So without further ado, let's get down to what I did. If you look back at, you look at what India is today, you will realize that 4 years ago, in 2014, a fairly momentous event took place, momentous political event took place in India. We saw the emergence of a government for the first time, which had an absolute majority in parliament of its own. India has a parliamentary system of government, which means that every 5 years you have elections. The party that is the largest party selects the prime minister, and the prime minister then selects his cabinet, and this gets endorsed by parliament, and then they start functioning as the executive. So you have the classical division between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. For decades before this, in fact, Rajiv Gandhi in 1984 was the last prime minister who had a majority of his party. After that, we've had coalition governments. In 2014, Mr. Narendra Modi came to power with his BJP party, which was momentous not only because he had a majority of his own, but it was momentous because for the first time, a right-wing party, a professed right-wing nationalist party, had come to power. This did not indicate, in my opinion at least, and I think most people will agree, this was not the result of some kind of, mass swing towards right-wing politics. It was just that there was a deep disenchantment with the kind of governance that was provided by the centrist coalition, which was led by the Congress Party, the erstwhile Congress Party, which preceded this. In fact, most of us, including me, have often referred to it as 5 years of policy paralysis, where there was a lot of talk, but nothing really got done on the ground. Not unexpectedly, the expectations from the Modi government were very, very high. Right? It was, in my opinion, the dice were loaded against Mr. Modi in 2014 because the expectation that people had generated about what he can do was way beyond the capacity of any political party in India to deliver. If he delivers even 50% of that, it would have been a miracle. But he is not a miracle, so he is not going to come anywhere close to 50%. But while the expectations of the Indians, I understand, were very high from Mr. Modi, it is quite interesting that the expectations of the rest of the world were equally high, and it is amazing how the rest of the world really wanted Mr. Modi, not because of his politics, but wanted India to succeed, because world over, even today, probably India and China are seen as these locomotives which would get the world out of the economic crisis that seems to have encompassed everyone. Now, before I can launch into any kind of serious analysis of India's foreign policy and its conduct and its interactions with the great powers, it is necessary to try and understand what are the drivers of Indian foreign policy. And in this sense, it is absolutely essential that we look at the domestic challenges that are faced by the government. Let me start by just reeling out some figures for you, because I'll keep referring to them throughout, so that you have some kind of idea, and then we can sort of come back to this if necessary. So, for example, India's current GDP is approximately around $2.3, $2.4 trillion, right? The per capita income is about somewhere between $1,700 to $1,800. Our population currently is estimated to be anything between 1.2 and 1.4. We've not had a census for some time. 1.2 to 1.4 billion people. India's defense expenditure is about 8%, I think 8 or 9, 8.7, yes, percent of the total expenditure of its budget. Its expenditure on health is about 1.7% of its total budget, and its expenses on education are about 2.6%. Now, I'm just giving you an indication of how India's budget is distributed broadly, and also to show you some of the challenges that exist. For example, according to the World Bank, only about 85 or 87% of the population has access to electricity. That is, households have access to electricity, 88%, let's say, or somewhere around that. Access to electricity is a nice way of hiding the fact that it does not mean that this household necessarily has 24 hours electricity. It merely means that there is a line that connects a bulb to something that generates electricity, and mercifully a couple of hours in a day, they may actually light up that bulb. But there are many, so if you actually look at it, probably access of households with electricity is much lower This is a misnomer. Similarly, we have about something between 80 to 85% literacy. But again, we in the world under the UN have decided that what constitutes literacy is your ability to sign. So if you can sign a document, that means you're literate. But I have seen many an Indian villager come into the metro in Delhi and not know what to do. So their literacy is not even at the functional level where they can see an image. Forget about reading what's written, but look at an image and figure out what is the next step. So even if you put a figure with an arrow, people may not know that that is what they have to do, because that's not the way you function back home in a village. So you have to understand that, again, all these figures that, vis-a-vis India at least, all these figures that people throw at you are not necessarily the correct figures. I think those of you who are from South Asia will understand what I am talking about much better than people who are in the developed world. But nevertheless, so coming back to where I wanted to talk about the challenges. So if you see these figures that I have briefly given you, you would understand that India today is the home to more than 1/3 of the world's poor. So more than 1/3 of the world's poor are living in the landmass that is called India. And how do we define that? Now, 1/3 of, in India at least, poverty, after the World Bank and the Indian government have come to an agreement that anybody who earns more than $1.25 in a day is not poor. Anyone who earns less than $1.25 a day, is poor. I don't know how many of you have been here, been to India, but I think it would be an interesting challenge. $1.25 would be approximately 100 rupees, I would love to see someone try and survive a day on 100 rupees, in which they would have to eat their meals, go to an office, come back home, and let's assume for a moment they're not burdened with a family. It's impossible. It's point blank impossible. It may be possible if you are in the rural parts of India. Then, of course, life is completely different because in some cases, there's a lot of self-sustaining that goes on there. So money is not necessarily the most important component of their life. But anyhow, to make it simple, it translates to about 400 million people. So out of this 1.2 billion, you have about 400 million who are poor, officially poor. I would suggest that you can easily add another 200 million to them who will be between $1.25 and $2. There will be another 200 million people who we can safely add to this list of poor. Why am I emphasizing this? I'm emphasizing this because these 600 million people are voters. They're active voters. 5 years, 2019, that is next year, they will actually go to vote. So it becomes very important for the government that is elected and voted in to address some of these issues. So it becomes one of the prime drivers of government's domestic and subsequently we'll see also foreign policy. So the first challenge is elimination of poverty. Whether that is done through, there are multiple methods of doing this. You can do direct transfer of money to individuals, you provide employment, and employment is the second challenge. Every year, India is so-called blessed with what is called the youth bulge. That is 65% of India's population is below 35. Which approximately means that every month you have a little over 1 million people coming into the job market. In other words, the government of India should, theoretically, be providing 12 million jobs a year. Anywhere between 12 to 14 million jobs a year. The government of India for the last 10 years on average has provided about 300,000 jobs a year. So these are the problems that you have. It's not only the government, I'm talking of the market as a whole, which includes the private sector. The Indian economy, if you look at it, is divided between the public sector and the private sector, and the private sector accounts for more than 75% of the economy. You have to also recognize that 60% of our population lives in rural areas, and whereas earlier agriculture constituted more than 50% of the economy, today the contribution of agriculture is less than 30%. So there is a huge mismatch that India has at many, many levels. And this is also without taking into consideration the regional aspects, where you have a relatively better development on the western coast of India. You know, from Gujarat to Kerala, you have states which are relatively better off by all indices, whether it is health, whether it's education, whether it's employment, and you have relatively poorer states on the eastern side. You know, if you were to draw a line in the middle of the subcontinent, as it were. But so these challenges together is what I believe, and it's my belief that from what they call a demographic dividend, I believe that this could turn, if current trends are anything to go by, this could turn into a demographic nightmare. Because if you have 65% of the population below 35, and if you have even 50% of them unemployed, they're not going to sit back quietly for very, very long. People are going to protest, people are going to come out on the street, it's going to be very, very chaotic. So the Indian government has a huge number of challenges in front of it. To roughly tell you that India requires also to very rapidly improve the level of its infrastructure. So at one level you have your social and economic issues, the other is to address those you need to improve your infrastructure. And it's not just about roads and ports and communications. It is also, for example, hospitals. Today, on average, per every 1,000 Indians, there are less than 0.7 hospital beds. So that means the chance, if 2 people in 1,000 fall ill, they'll have to fight over a hospital bed, theoretically. That is what it boils down to. So there are challenges in schools. There are not enough schools, there are not enough hospitals. So I think I don't have to discuss any further this issue, because it gives you the grim, pessimistic picture of where India is. Now, I have to confess that after the 5 years of this policy paralysis that existed, Mr. Modi has come to this challenge with a great amount of energy. He has rebranded several schemes that were launched by the previous governments. He's re-energized some of them. He's launched programs like Make in India, where foreign investment is being invited to come into the country, and liberal conditions will be created to encourage them to start manufacturing products within the country. The Make in India campaign has not been a humongous success so far, but that is probably because, as with anything, there is a certain gestation period. If you want to set up a factory, it's not going to start producing the day you decide or sign on paper that you're starting the factory. It's going to take 2-3 years. So to evaluate whether the Make in India campaign is a real success, I think we will have to look at it maybe a couple of years from now. But if you were to look at what is happening, I think the signs are somewhat encouraging. The inflow of foreign capital has increased, and Mr. Modi has started a very interesting policy which I don't think other countries had thought of till recently. He is trying to use one of India's weaknesses to make it into its strength. And one of India's major weaknesses is that India has an aspiration to be a great global power. India believes that it should sit at the high table and decide how the rest of the world should run. But I do not believe you can give me an example of any great power that exists or existed in the world that existed as a great power on the basis of imported arms. India almost entirely imports its armaments, right? So clearly there is a dichotomy between India's aspiration and its capabilities. So Mr. Modi has very interestingly tried to address that. He has created a policy whereby he encourages production of defense equipment within India. It need not necessarily be for consumption in India. It can also be export oriented. But given the fact that Indian labor is relatively cheap, in most cases it will be that you will be able to produce whatever the platform is, whether it's a tank or a helicopter, at rates that are much cheaper than it exists at this point of time. So this campaign, for example, Russia has joined it. They want to build a helicopter, helicopter factory in South India, and the talks are at a very advanced stage. There is a decision pending on selection of an aircraft for the Indian Air Force, which will be decided between either the French or the Americans, and then that aircraft is going to be manufactured in India. So it's a double sort of benefit. One is you're creating jobs. The second thing is that you're learning, you're absorbing technology, and you're building capacity for your own industries in the country. The past 3 years, if you look at the figures, India has seen fairly good economic growth. In fact, today, in this year, it has already overtaken, it's become the fastest growing economy in the world. But again, before I go into the foreign policy challenges, I'd like to point out that India needs to grow at a rate above 8%, above 7%. For a very sustained period of time of about 10 to 15 years, if it's even going to lift 2/3 of those who are below the poverty line, above the poverty line, build its infrastructure and meets the fresh demands on health, education, and other issues that are social, that a welfare government is supposed to provide. The prospects at this point of time appear good of that, but for that to actually be able to be sustained, India needs to be able to engage with the rest of the world in a manner that gives it that opportunity. India does not have sufficient funds to meet these challenges. Right? We need about $1 trillion a year just to invest in our infrastructure, you know. There was an estimate made by our previous Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, who was an economist, who said that this was said sometime shortly before 2014, that India needed over the next 10 years close to $2.5–3 trillion to be able to meet the various demands that the country made. India is not capable of raising that kind of money. So obviously this money will have to come from outside India. And therefore, for it to be able to come from outside India, India will have to convince whoever is investing that India is a stable country, that the investments will bring returns. Over and above that, India will have to do its utmost to maintain good relations with all the sources of this money. So be it China, be it Japan, or be it Western Europe. India will reach out to these areas to try and attract capital. So it is but natural that India's foreign policy is going to be guided by these imperatives of trying to make India an attractive economic destination. And for that, one of the fundamental things that the government has undertaken, during our discussion we can look at whether it is successful or not, but the fact is that the government undertook a policy which it calls the neighborhood policy. To put it simply, if India wanted to be, India cannot be an oasis of development if it is surrounded by countries which are not equally invested in its development program. In other words, if whether it is Nepal, whether it is Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, whoever is in the neighborhood, Maldives, China for that matter, that unless they are invested in India's and see benefits out of India's development, India is unlikely to get the support that is required for its development. So the first policy was what he called the neighborhood policy. It started off with a big bang. 2014, when he was elected, he invited all South Asian leaders to come for his inaugural, which was in May 2014. Many did come. All South Asian leaders actually came, including from Pakistan, from Nepal, Bhutan. Everybody did come. And I think there was a huge amount of positive expectation that at last, South Asia would be able to get over the schisms that were dividing it and try and move together in a direction of peaceful economic development. It's not entirely so today, unfortunately, but to some extent, maybe some of that has worked. For example, India's relationship with Bhutan has improved. I mean, Bhutan and India were always close. But if you were to look at today, it has improved considerably. Our relationship, again, I'm making an assessment of the past 4 years. Our relationship with Nepal, let's say, has become a little bit more realistic, if that is the right way to put it. I would not call it worse, for the simple reason that I think this was coming. Although Nepal is fully dependent on India because it's, in a sense, landlocked, it receives all from starting with its fuel to its produce to its daily needs of rice and everything. Everything comes through India. But while that is a tremendous dependency, Nepal also does not want to be seen as a surrogate of India. That's a natural national pride that exists in everyone. So that tension is playing out. Our relationship with Bangladesh has improved phenomenally. Our relationship with Sri Lanka has improved. Our relationship with Myanmar is a real revelation. It's stepped forward by really leaps and bounds. Our relationship with India's relationship with Pakistan is very difficult to assess. You see, because both sides, I mean, it takes two hands to clap. Let me be very clear from the beginning itself. I'm not one of those Indians who says that, Pakistan is at fault for everything. But at the same time, I am not one of those Indians who claims to be an expert on Pakistan. So I am a minority of 1 in 1.2 billion, because all other Indians know everything they need to know about Pakistan. But unfortunately, I don't. So I will not comment too much on that part of our policy. But overall, what I think is that it is a good thing that India is engaged with its neighborhood. It's got rid of some of its big brother attitude, where it thought that, these small little countries around us, they have no choice, but we are the big brother. So it's shedding that, and they're discovering that the neighbors, there is another phenomenon that has happened. It's not just that India is losing its arrogance. There is something that's happened that is making it lose its arrogance, and will deal with separately, but in a short, it's the rise of China. And it is the rise of China and its entry into South Asia that is suddenly making India wake up, because India's neighbors are suddenly discovering the joys of non-alignment. Oops, there are two powers, we can play them against each other and see what we can gain. India played the game of non-alignment right after the 50s, and now it's suddenly discovered that the others have discovered the same joys. So there you are. Welcome to the new world, as it were. So to cut it short, there are some connectivity projects which are working out very well between Myanmar, Bangladesh, India. There's China also involved in it. Overall, the potential exists to connect South Asia and turn it into a kind of a vehicle of growth. There are difficulties. Some are historical legacy difficulties, which India will have to address and India will have to deal with. And I think it is doing so pretty well. But the jury is out on whether they will really succeed. You will be surprised, and now I don't think you'll be surprised, but this will probably be the first lecture of any kind on Indian foreign policy where there is going to be no mention of Pakistan. And as I said, I'm not doing that because I really know nothing about it. The only comment I'll make is, and this I'm making not as an Indian, but even, the problem is that how do you deal with Pakistan? And this is more of a rhetorical, philosophical question. When you are a civilian government, you want to engage with the civilian government on the other side. But when it comes to policy vis-a-vis India, the civilian government in Pakistan has no say. It is the military that decides what the policy vis-a-vis India will be. But the government of India will not engage directly with the Pakistani military, because that would mean it is subverting the civilian government of Pakistan. So India has a serious dilemma of how to deal with Pakistan. But that is not a justification for not dealing with Pakistan. If India is the big power in the region, India has to find ways of how it wants to deal with this situation. So it's not something that India can just walk away from. After South Asia, when you look at the rest of the world, what is the most important power that India has to engage with? In the last, since 2000, I would say that power that has emerged as the most important power for India is the United States of America. The United States of America is by far, I think, the most important bilateral relationship we have today. And I would be very safe in saying that never have India and the United States been as close as they are today. There are many factors for this. One, and this is no particular order, but I'm just naming. One is that there is an affinity of values between the two countries. We at least constitutionally, we are democracies. They are, of course, a presidential democracy. We are a parliamentary democracy. But the fundamental values are the same that are enshrined in our constitutions. The second thing that keeps us linked together is the Indian diaspora, which is very, very active in the United States and is one of the richest diasporas in the United States, contributes substantially to political parties, and is very active in promoting the relationship. So that is something that is a driver. India also believes that the US can be a significant factor in India's economic development. And India is hoping that it can benefit from not only transfers of production lines, but also transfer of technologies. And in particular, India is very keen to get high technology from the United States. Not just military, but it would like to transform itself into a 21st century economy. And the other thing is that, of course, and this is maybe the most important, but I mean, that's for you to judge, that in the emerging new world, which is, I would say, somewhat asymmetrical, the United States still remains the preeminent power. It is not the sole power, superpower as it was. It has lost some of that, but it is still the power that is by far larger than all the others. I mean, China is the one that is challenging it, but it's still got some way to go. And it is China's rise that India is not very comfortable with. And therefore, it looks at United States as a kind of a balancer in this relationship that it has in Asia with China. But it also looks at the United States as a country that will help it meet its aspirations of becoming a great power. Let me give you an example. India and the United States signed a deal on nuclear civil nuclear cooperation. Till 2008, India was under sanctions because India did what it called a peaceful nuclear explosion in 1974, right? And from then onwards, there were sanctions on India. And we have lived under these sanctions without much, I mean, not much noise has been made of it. But these sanctions have existed till 2008. The only reason the Russians, the French, all of them were willing to work with us in the nuclear area. But they could not because of these sanctions. And it is because the United States decided that the time had come to build a closer relationship with India, that it entered into negotiations on this nuclear deal. And once the nuclear deal was signed, it moved all the necessary UN and international bodies to have the sanctions on India removed. So India became a member of the Vienna organization, I forgot the name. IAEA, yeah. India was a member of IAEA, but India was signed an additional protocol which removed the restrictions on nuclear trade. So India can now receive goods, including fuel from other countries that have nuclear technologies. And India can also supply those countries with nuclear technology and expertise. And one of those things is, for example, Russia and India have now signed an agreement with Bangladesh where India and Russia are jointly going to build a nuclear power plant in Bangladesh. So, this removal of restrictions has also helped India in another way. It has opened itself to collaboration with other countries, and India developed its own nuclear energy for all these years, but had hit a kind of a glass ceiling. We were able to develop on our own a nuclear reactor which came up to 850 megawatts of power, but we were not able to transcend that. Whereas in the rest of the world, if you look at France, Russia, people are making nuclear reactors that are capable of producing, 1,000 megawatts or 2 megawatts of power. Now, for some reason, our scientists were unable to break this great glass ceiling. But now with the cooperation being opened up, they can move into these areas. So that is another reason, that's another thing that the United States is important. Of course, the United States also wants India to be partner in its balancing act vis-a-vis China, but that India is not strong enough to even attempt to join any kind of efforts to contain China. The second aspect is, of course, because China is the second most important relationship that India has. And it is extremely important in many ways. One is, China is still an adversary. We have a border dispute. So in other sense, there is a military dispute between India and China since 1962. It's a different matter that is a border on which since 1967 not a single shot has been fired. Nobody has died. So it's been very stable and steady, but it is also a source of immense tension because, it's what is called the difference of depth of perception. In other words, the Chinese believe that their border runs where this gentleman is sitting, right, facing me. And the Indians believe that their border runs in my seat. So the Indian patrols will come up to here, and the Chinese patrols will go up to there and maybe pitch a tent. Now, if somebody comes and pitches a tent there, the Indians are going to get nervous about it and upset. So that leads to tensions. So obviously, it is not an easy situation where this has to be managed. The second problem is, and all of you know this, I don't think political economists need to be told this, China is the place which has the money. The great trillions of dollars that India wants in its investments lies in China, mostly. And you will see that India is the largest recipient of funds from the AIIB, as well as the New Development Bank of BRICS. And of course, there the New Development Bank is a different kettle of fish because everyone has contributed equally. I mean, they're all equal partners. But AIIB is completely a Chinese-driven bank. And yet, it has received the maximum funds. So, India has to walk this tightrope of maintaining an adversarial relationship on the ground vis-à-vis the border, but at the same time, trying to provide maximum beneficial conditions for China to be able to invest in India. So if Indians are sometimes a little schizophrenic about it, I mean, I don't think you should hold them to a very high standard on that. The third thing, of course, is the emergence of the Belt and Road Initiative. In India, this is, and I'm sure we'll discuss it, so I'll just in a nutshell. In India, this is seen as a project which is aimed at exporting and promoting or extending, if you want, China's geopolitical influence. It also happens to impinge upon India's sovereignty because India has also a dispute on territorial dispute, not just a border dispute, but a territorial dispute with Pakistan. We can't decide who the state of Jammu and Kashmir belongs to. India claims that that entire state belongs to India, and Pakistan believes that it should belong to Pakistan. Part of this BRI, the so-called CPEC part, that is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, goes through this disputed territory. And obviously, India feels that this impinges upon its sovereignty, and therefore it cannot recognize this. So therefore, there are tensions, as it were, on this issue of OBOR, which, fortunately or unfortunately, many of India's partners in South Asia, in Central Asia, in West Asia, have actually welcomed with open arms. So it does create tensions. India has come up with alternatives. There is an alternative project that is being launched with Iran, Russia, and India, which is called the North-South Corridor. Again, that's something we can discuss subsequently. In a nutshell, I think the relationship between China and India has a whole lot of potential. It has already a very strong economic base. India and China have a lot in common in sense politically. Both of them want to have a greater say in how the world is run. Both of them feel that they have inadequate representation. And both of them recognize that they are not willing to accept any single hegemony. So in that sense, India and China share a view that we do not want a US hegemony in the world. But at the same time, again, India's schizophrenia, we have to ally with the US because we have to balance China. So these are difficult times, as it were, for all of us. Third relationship that is important for us is Russia. The relationship with Russia is very, very important because I have to take you back, rewind to the 60s. India was a poor, underdeveloped state. We've just fought a war. Our self-esteem was very low. The Chinese thrashed us. And suddenly the Soviets arrived and said that, okay, we're going to help. And it was a different matter, of course, that the Soviets were having their own differences with the Chinese at that point in 1962. So India's entire industrial base, which today is so strong, was built with the help of the Soviets. The Soviets helped us start our oil and gas industries. They helped us start our metallurgical industries. They strengthened our steel production. So there is nothing, mining. There are practically no major industries in which the Soviets did not provide technology, finance at very comfortable rates. And of course, what is even more important, they gave us sophisticated arms, which were like, in those years, the MiG-21 was the top of the line aircraft. The Russians not just gave us the MiG-21, they started producing it in India. So that developed. Then, for example, they virtually set up our fleet, with training the sailers. Nuclear submarines were coming from there. And today you have a unique situation that Russia and India have a unique relationship. It's fraying at many levels, but there is one aspect which is unique, not there with any other country. Russia leases a nuclear submarine to India. I don't think there is any country in the world that is capable of producing or has nuclear submarines that would lend it to another country. And the United States will never lend a nuclear submarine to Great Britain. It will never lend a nuclear submarine to Israel. And these are its two closest allies, with whom they have 100% trust, as it were. So you can understand that there is a level of relationship that in the 60s and 70s developed with the then Soviet Union, that today to many people in India, they're very uncomfortable with the fact that there is a growing distance between India and Russia. And partly that growing distance is because of India's growing closeness with the United States. So obviously Russia is not very happy with that. The United States in the last 5 years has emerged as one of the major arms suppliers to India. The other problem is that since 2014, since the estrangement between Russia and the West, the Russians have, in the Indian perception, moved closer to China. So that negates the entire concept of what started in 62. In 1962, the alliance between Soviet Union and India was essentially based on the fact that we were going to balance China. In 1971, when an Indo-Soviet treaty was signed, it was to ensure that the creation of Bangladesh was not stopped by the United States and China. So there was always this balance, but today that balance has changed. So India is worried that Russia would not anymore be the most reliable of allies in case of a conflict with China. Then, of course, you have the relationship with Europe. India's relationship with Europe is rather weak. It is primarily because India does not view Europe as a security provider. There is a strong economic relationship. We trade a lot. There is investment. But Europe is not a security provider, and only recently has France come forward and signed an agreement. Just recently, Macron was in India, and we have agreed to start some kind of naval cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region. The French have agreed to increase their presence in the Indian Ocean. So maybe there are changes that are occurring there. So to cut a long story short, I personally believe that India's problems are really starting. In the beginning, I told you about all the economic problems. But there are problems even on the foreign policy arena, because, at one level, you had this great stable marriage you had with the Soviet Union and then subsequently Russia, which gave stability to your relationships to the. Now that marriage has gone to the dogs and you're heading for a messy divorce. In the meantime, you found other partners. But you're not used to that game. India is, in that sense, in the game of great powers, India is still in probably just about the kindergarten. It's in class 2 or class 3 maybe. And the great powers have been there for many. The Russians have a history. Soviet Union was a superpower. The Americans have been there in that game since World War II. So they have been at this for much longer. So they are kind of, they've gone out of college, whereas we are still in class 2. So we are going to make a lot of errors while we try to learn the difficult class of, international relations. And that is not going to help India. See, the problem is India has reached a stage where you could safely say that, like Stolypin said once about Russia and like Deng Xiaoping said about China, you need a period of time where you keep your head low, where everything is good and you can just focus on internal development. But unfortunately, we've reached a stage where the rest of the world is not going to leave India alone. India will have to react. Earlier you could say, okay, forget about everything, I'm going to develop internally. But now, for example, there are events that are taking place in the world which India cannot ignore. Let me give you one example. I just gave you one example of the CPEC. But there's another example, Afghanistan. There is Syria. In West Asia, India has 8 million Indian passport holders. They work there. Their contribution to India on an average is over $20 billion a year. They transfer that money to India. These are their remittances. India has a vital economic and national stake in stability in West Asia. But that stability is being eroded. Now, we cannot tomorrow turn around and say, oh, hold on, we are in this development mode, switch off everything, let us develop, then you can start your instability in West Asia. So we will have to start adjusting to it even before that. So therefore, while India would love to have a period of 20 years of uninterrupted development without any kind of distractions about, enemies, adversaries and all, but unfortunately, it is not probably possible in this world that this will happen. But India will be forced, therefore, in my opinion, to pursue policies of multiple alignments. It will have to strengthen its neighbors, strengthen its relations with its neighbors, with external powers. It has to recognize the realities of a multipolar world, or what I would call, the Russians like to call a polycentric world. And it's in some ways what I would call back to the future. Because today in India, it is very popular to pull down all policies that are associated with our first Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru. Jawaharlal Nehru set the base, as it were, of India's development. But today, particularly the strategic elite is pulling down his policies, saying that he did wrong on Kashmir, he did wrong on China, he did wrong on something else. There's a major attack against him. But the problem is, as I outlined, the policies that you're going to pursue are exactly what Mr. Nehru said. And let me quote. He said in 1947, that India has no choice but to propose to avoid entanglement in any blocks or groups of powers, realizing that only thus can we serve the cause of India and world peace. This policy sometimes leads to partisans of one group to imagine that we are supporting the other group. But every nation places its interests first. Fortunately, India's coincide with a peaceful foreign policy and cooperation with all nations. India has no choice. So this is another contradiction, that you're going to pursue a Nehruvian policy of non-alignment, but you're going to decry it and say that you are not non-aligned. So in the end, what I can say is this, that don't judge India, its economic development and its foreign policy through the words of its leaders. Disbelieve what they say on the world stage. Look at their actions, look at the numbers behind what they're saying. And then you will be able to see that whether India is pursuing its national interests, and you will be able to make a judgment whether it is successful or not. Thank you.
I guess that before such a wonderful and so enlightening lecture, I don't really think that anything is so adequately going to be said by me, because it's very difficult to speak after you, sir. And more so in today's occasion. And thanks a lot for giving our students, most of them are not from India, I believe. So they would be having a much fundamental understanding about the present dynamics of the Indian state, both inside as well as outside. I would open the floor for the questions and discussions, but just to have a small remark from our class understanding about global political economy. As we have understood in our understanding with the emerging powers dynamics and the way they are basically trying to wrest from the West the kind of predominant political and economic position, there is something that we have discussed, I guess, in our previous classes, and Mr. Nandan Unnikrisnan has so poignantly explained that different policy dynamics that has taken place in an emerging economy called India. Its quest for advocacy coalition framework, the way there is policy design that has been taking place in an external policy framework. We have also listened at length about India's difficult choice to walk a tightrope. And I guess that is the case with any one of the emerging powers. I would really be keen to listen from your side, sir. With such of a fanfare that 9 years ago, the first summit of, the formal first summit of BRICS had taken place in Yekaterinburg, as I remember it right. 8 years down the line, things have changed quite a bit. The leadership of Brazil has basically been tamed and emasculated, if at all you say, a kind of a soft coup d'etat that has taken place there 2 years ago. Russia has to do a lot of things to stabilize its home post-2014. And India has got closer to the Western, I would say, economic and political positions on different political issues, economic issues. So we would be happy to have your comments on the two different regional organizations. One is, of course, SCO and its membership that India and Pakistan both had at the same time, as well as in the BRICS. And how India is going to basically either to support the project, which stands vis-a-vis United States or the Western Alliance, or basically it is going to be a bridge to find more conciliatory political and economic mapping. That's the question from my side, and I'm sure that there will be more of that.
You'll have to enlighten me. Do I answer each question as soon as it's asked, or do we take 2-3 questions and then?
I would be fine if at all there are other interventions, but yeah, if at all you can start with it, because they would have a lot of questions from our students too.
Then I'll answer this first. And first about BRICS. The momentum of BRICS is not being stopped because of Brazil, India, or anyone else in that sense. In fact, I disagree that the momentum of BRICS has stalled. BRICS will go on because the fundamental glue that brought all these countries together was to redefine the rules of global governance. In other words, none of the countries, maybe Russia is the only special case, but otherwise, none of the countries who are BRICS are revolutionary powers. They don't want to change the world. They're evolutionary powers. The R is missing. So they just want the world to evolve in a manner that allows them to have a greater say in the rules of governance. That's all. Right? So that glue has not changed. Because that glue will mean that it's not only about, greater weightage in voting in World Bank or IMF. It also means you have to see a restructuring of the United Nations. You have to definitely see a restructuring of the United Nations Security Council. I mean, it makes absolutely no sense that Great Britain is a power with veto. Right? I mean, in this modern world, yes, after 1945, maybe. At that time, even India wasn't free, so we were part of the jewels of the crown, as it was. So Great Britain was an empire. But today, in 2018, there's absolutely no reason for it to be a veto-bearing member of the United Nations Security Council. Because if the only thing that all 5 veto-bearing members have is that they all 5 have nuclear weapons. But then by that logic, many others should be put in there. Right? So it can't be a criteria that, the criteria of selection of countries to the Global Governance Board, if you want, have to change. And that hasn't happened. And so therefore, I personally believe that BRICS will continue. Right? The second thing is, the BRICS, for example, the institutions that BRICS are setting up, are alternate. They're not alternatives, but they're supplementary. The BRICS Bank, for example, is not attempting to replace the World Bank. But what the BRICS Bank does, it gives loans in a manner that are more acceptable to developing countries. It is not just about the percentage, but it is about the conditionalities. There are no conditionalities attached which demand political or economic changes in the country, unlike in the World Bank. There is no liberal prescription, liberal economic prescription. It may be good or bad, I'm not getting into that. But I'm saying that many developing countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, would prefer to get their loans out of NDB because of these lack of conditionalities. Right? It does not mean that there is a lack of monitoring. It does not mean that you give funds and they have gone into some pipeline, into someone's pocket. There is a rigorous monitoring system. But it also means that there is no attempt at regime change. I mean, let's put it like that. So BRICS, I believe, will continue. As far as SCO is concerned, again, India, for example, is not going to challenge. India does not see SCO as an alternative to, let's say, NATO, right? That is not India's intention. India believes that as a great power, it should have a greater profile in a variety of regions that it considers to be strategic. So Central Asia is part of an extended strategic neighborhood. And SCO has all 5 members of the Central Asian states. Sorry, not 5. Turkmenistan is not there. 4 of the 5. So it gives India an opportunity to interact with them in a multilateral fora, look at their problems and see how India can contribute. We cannot compete in terms of money. India does not have the money to provide. But India has expertise in many areas. Let me give you an example. For example, if you come to Indian defense colleges, you find a very large number of students from Central Asia. I mean, these are military, they're not students, they are military personnel. But these military personnel find courses in India useful. Right? We do capacity building in computer sciences. There are many students from Central Asia, Africa, very many countries, who are studying in the Nehru University, for example. So therefore, SCO becomes a platform for India to be able to understand and respond to the needs of its partners. And the third factor where it's very important is SCO in all probability will emerge as the vehicle that will help stabilize Afghanistan. Because it already has all the regional bodies, all the regional neighboring countries of Afghanistan. It has China, India, Russia, right? And the only one missing in that sense is the United States. Right? But nevertheless, so you can have an SCO plus 1 process or SCO plus 2. But SCO, in my opinion, is going to emerge as a major body in which will contribute towards stability in Afghanistan. And again, I have a suspicion that the Afghan people would like that rather than direct intervention by the US or anyone else. Because their sensitivities will be taken into consideration by their neighbors, they feel, in a much better manner. So therefore, I don't see the imminent death of either BRICS or SCO.
You need to use the microphone.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just have two questions to ask. One is with regard to Indian foreign policy. You made mention that the USA, Russia, and China play a very important part with regards to Indian foreign policy, and you also mentioned about the economic corridor between Pakistan and China. Don't you think that serves as a wake-up call to India to really redirect its foreign policy? Because you also mentioned that Russia is not a partner to be trusted. So if India wants to play that smart game of playing between these three global powers, not having side to play on or want to use all of them together, don't you think that can backflash to India and can really affect them in the future? Because if you look at history, those countries who try to play the same game has fell into trouble. So what do you think should be India's foreign policy in the future?
One is, I said at the end, that's why I said that we are still in kindergarten and we have a long way to go. We may make mistakes. But what you have to consider is that other countries that have played the game of trying to play one against the other or trying for benefits have normally been much smaller countries. India is already the 4th largest economy in the world. You can't ignore it. Right? The world can't allow India to fail. Let's put it slightly differently. Let me give you a nightmare scenario. Imagine India collapses, right? It's economic chaos. What do you think is going to happen? The population of India is going to move. It will want to move from an area of instability. Where do you think they will move? Surrounded by seas everywhere. They're going to go north. If they land up in Europe, what has happened with the Syrian crisis will seem like paradise compared to millions of Indians crossing across. So therefore, there is a huge difference in India playing the game with various powers and what the others did historically. That is one aspect. The second aspect is India is not playing, in that sense, it's not trying to play one against the other. This is about whether you are an adversary or an enemy or a friend. India is saying, I am equal to all of you. I may be weaker in some areas, I may be stronger in some areas, but I'm equal to all of you. I have a right to sit at the table at which you decide what is to be done. So if you decide that climate change means cutting emissions, by all means. But if you're telling me to cut emissions, then I have to be at that table to decide what I will cut. So India joins the Paris Agreement. But India has joined the Paris Agreement and said, we will decide how much and what we can cut because I have 400 million people who don't have access to anything. Now, if I have to give them electricity, if I have to give them food, their energy profile is going to go up. There is no option. I may use renewables, but their energy profile will go up. Emissions in India will go up. You cannot take this as the baseline and say, now reduce. So you'll have to give India time lead of 1930, 1935. So India is saying we have to be at that table, because if you take a decision without us, please go ahead, be my guest. But imagine what will happen to all of you. So that is the reason this game, in that sense, is not a game. It's a completely different situation. The second point is, I mean, if you go into international relations, there are various theories, but there is one which is which is called the realist theory. And in that, essentially, it says that ultimately nations, irrespective of their weaknesses or strengths, they ultimately defend their national interest. Now, let me give you an example. India was very weak. In 1961, India was weak. 1962, it got thrashed by the Chinese, right? But in 1961, despite its weakness, despite its this, it liberated Goa from the Portuguese and the French. Right? Now, you have a situation where in 1971, it intervened, but that of course was an exceptional circumstance, but it intervened on the border in the what was then East Pakistan because of the huge influx of refugees that you had. India was facing a huge problem, and on humanitarian grounds, without going into the history, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese and the United States were against that. But a weak India stood up for what it thought was its national interest and did what it had to do. But to counter that, it tied up with someone else. So this game, or what you call a game, is actually about each country defending what they consider their core interests. There are some things on which you will compromise, undoubtedly. But there are some things on which you will not compromise. And India's statement to the world is precisely that there are some things on which we will compromise, some things on which we can cooperate, but there are some things on which we will not cooperate. It's as simple as that.
My second question will be on Pakistan. We have seen several negotiations has taken place between India and Pakistan in the past, but there is still no diplomatic solution with regards to the two countries. So what do you think, based on your experience, what do you think should be used to get a solution? Because every now and then we see in the media, protests or kind of a fight between two groups in the Kashmir regions and a lot of life loss. So what do you think, what mechanism do you think India should put into play to solve this issue?
I'll answer your question, but I first want a counter question, if you'll permit me. Whatever is happening between India and Pakistan, show me one country that has been affected by it.
I don't mean the people, the countries affected, but I'm talking about the life loss. Because
No, I know. That's why I said, but I'm saying that I understand that
because what I think is your neighbor is the most important ally or partner you have. So if your neighbor is in trouble, you are also likely to be in trouble.
No, I understand what you're saying. I was trying to draw another parallel. What I was trying to say is that what is happening between India and Pakistan is not an international issue. It is a bilateral problem. And so the fundamental solution to that is a bilateral solution, right? Let me give you an example. For example, problem we have with China is not a purely bilateral problem, because China's border dispute with India also implies a border dispute with Bhutan and between Bhutan and India, in theory, because China is claiming a territory which Bhutan and India have sorted out, but it's claiming a territory that is sorted out between Bhutan and India, and we don't believe belongs to China. So there is an international issue. There's more than two countries involved. There is in the so-called CPEC area, the Karakoram, we believe that Pakistan has given away to China a chunk of territory which it cannot give because it's a disputed territory, right? So our differences with China are not purely bilateral. Our differences with Pakistan are purely bilateral. That is one. The second aspect is no two nations should have a kind of relationship that results in death. Whether it's civilians or whether it is military, it doesn't matter. You should not reach a situation where people are dying. And therefore, you need to build confidence-building measures to start with that will eliminate the possibility of fire, I mean arms, being used in between the two countries. For example, again, India's relationship with China. The border is tense. We have the same problem about where the border is. But since 1967, not one bullet has been fired there. We've had tensions. Just recently, last year, there was the whole problem in an area called Doklam, which involved Bhutan, India, and China. But eventually, it got resolved because there's a mechanism for resolution. The same thing India and Pakistan have to resolve. They have to build a mechanism. But this is where the problem arises. That's what I'm saying. If India negotiates, and it did negotiate with a package deal with the civilian government, but then the next thing you knew is there was a coup. So you have to deal with a military government, and the military government refuses to recognize it, whatever the deal was. Okay, so you restart talking. You see, so India faces a problem. I'm not saying there is no solution to it, but India faces a genuine problem, and I'm not being nasty, but how do I put this without being offensive? You have a situation where every country, every nation has its army. In Pakistan's case, the army has a nation. And this is a problem. So the solution to India-Pakistan is not entirely between India and Pakistan. Pakistan has to sort out its internal problem. The divisions in Pakistan have to be sorted out by Pakistani people. Nobody else can sort it out for them. And the day they arrive at a solution to their internal differences, I think many of their problems, whether with Afghanistan or with India, will get sorted out. However, the only caveat I'll add there is India is going through its own internal social crisis because of the current right-wing government in power. So that will also impinge on the relationship with Pakistan because there's religion involved. And we need to see how that develops to see what impact it will have on the bilateral relationship. But to go back to the original statement I made, when I started saying this, I said it takes two hands to clap. So you can't say that the fault is either Pakistani or Indian. And they both have to sit down and try and sort this out together. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. So the first one is you said that the Modi government has been trying to get FDIs, investment capitals from...
Sorry?
So you talked about how Modi's government is trying to get FDIs, foreign direct investments from other countries, and also capitals for providing more jobs, for providing economic growth. However, I was wondering if the federal system of India play an influence in this, because, like for instance, in the Indian Constitution, Article 282 allows states to freely use financial resources, and Article 293 allows states to borrow without a limit. So when you get into the decision-making process, like trying to formulate specific policies, the state level has less of a capacity to influence what the state level. I mean, the central government will have less of an influence over the states, because when states make certain sets of policy for attracting FDIs, they would have they would sometimes disagree with the central government, therefore creating more of a complicated problem. So I was hoping that if we could introduce what sets of policy that different states in India, also the central government, have made for attracting FDI, and also if there's any follow-up, build-up in infrastructure for supporting such a, let's say the build-up of factories for supply chains, for transportation, etc. And my second question would be that, you talked about how economic imperatives determine foreign policy in India. However, I was wondering if the policy design space in India has been jeopardized by the rise of populism because, because Modi is perceived in India as a strong leader, and then the public discourse regarding, let's say, the dispute with China has by and large been deteriorating, and coupled with this sense of populism in India, so the government sometimes they will have to necessarily respond to the public plea of like trying to put up like a really strong image against foreign threat. So I was wondering if this factor also influence the decision making in the foreign policy and foreign affairs. Thank you.
No, you're absolutely right about center state. In India, we have a federal system, but the states have considerable powers, and any foreign direct investment project that comes in obviously is not something that comes in the air and has to be placed in a particular area. So what normally happens, the practice is that the evaluation that is done by the company or the country that wants to pursue a particular project, they start at the state level. They start their process of evaluation and negotiation at the state level, and then along with the state, once the terms are worked out, they come to the center. So that makes it much simpler for the center to give the necessary approvals that the center has to do. But it does not always work like this, because you have significant differences in states on, for example, issues like land. Different states have different ways of dealing with land acquisition, and it is a major impediment. So therefore, recently you had an attempt. In fact, it was started by the previous government, but was concluded, I think, in the Modi government, where a Land Acquisition Act was passed, where you've brought some broad parameters as to how land can be acquired for projects. It also must be kept in mind that there isn't that much industrial land available in India, because industrial land is not just about a piece of land. It also has to be something that has access to water as well as electricity. So, all this goes together. But the government, and that is what I said, that this government seems to be aware of it. So you have multiple connectivity projects which are going on in India, which are connecting various ports with each other, as well as with production centers in the country. You're having creation of industrial zones, which will have dedicated electricity supply and water supply, so making it attractive for foreign investors in different states, depending on where it is. So I think these are problems of Indian law, which had not been addressed for many, many years. And these problems are at last being addressed. And Indian politicians have been remarkably cooperative in that sense. When it comes to development, I think all of them recognize that 5 years hence somebody is going to vote for me, and that 65% are below 35. So I better at least appear to be trying to do something to provide jobs and development. So everyone is acutely aware of it, and therefore cooperation on development projects is, I would say, very good. Referring to your second question about, to complete the first question, has the Indian state so far been successful? It has been successful to the extent that it has maintained this plus 7% rate of growth, right? But they have not been successful in actual job creations. But they have been successful in dispersal of some of these funds that they have created, direct transfer, particularly in urban area, in rural areas. For example, there is a program where if you work for 100 days in a rural area, the government will give you X amount of money, right? That program was started under the government of Mr. Manmohan Singh. However, it has been continued by Mr. Modi, in fact reinforced. And there are problems in dispersals, but it is one of the major reasons that Indian agriculture is sustaining itself. Because effectively what it means is that every Indian farmer is guaranteed 100 days of wage. You see, which goes a long way, right? Now this is centrally dispersed to every state. This is not a state-driven project, right? So it's the center's responsibility to take this money, and the state provides the center with the list of farmers who have gone through a process of, there's a census that takes place. And the work which they do need not necessarily be on a farm. It could be building a road. Yeah, you want to ask me something?
Yes, because I was, from my previous knowledge, I know that like landlordism in India is still a significant factor in development. So I was wondering, so during the process of attracting FDI and land acquisition, farmers who lost their lands, they weren't actually the landowners, because the land that were privatized, that was sold to the foreign companies for building up factories, they were actually owned by people who didn't really farm. And then tenant farmers, they will lose their jobs in the field. And I was thinking that if government has made any compensation to those farmers who lost their job.
Yeah, so this NREGA program is part of addressing those worries and fears. The second aspect is India's land holdings, the problem is that they are too small. The farmer in India, the poorer farmer, not the rich farmer, his land holding is not economically sustainable. But at the same time, as every peasant, he does not want to give up his land. So there is a contradiction there, and the state definitely provides for a level of compensation if it acquires land, which is higher than what is the market rate. So that compensation exists, but the problem is that the poor farmer's land is so small that he doesn't really get enough to sustain himself forever after. Whereas the rich farmer, without losing all his land, selling only half of it, yet gets substantial amounts of money that can see him through and his family for the next couple of generations. So there is this problem. And that, of course, I'm not an economist, so I really don't know how that problem can be resolved. But it is a serious issue. It is an issue. Okay, and the next question was about populism. India is like the rest of the world. We are not immune to it. Populism or disguised nationalism, whichever you want to call it, exists all over the world. The reflections were in the United States, whether in Europe, look at what happened in Italy most recently. So India is not immune to it. We started it. In 2014, we were probably amongst the first, barring, I think, Philippines. This is a misguided backlash as what was perceived as inequities of globalization. See, unfortunately, it was misrepresented. Globalization, in fact, benefited countries like China, India. We found our connectivity with markets, we were able to export more, we were able to boost our growth. But there were people who, in one way or the other, managed to use this to whip up a sentiment against globalization. So you have America first, with Mr. Trump, or the Brexit in the in UK. And you have Mr. Modi in India, who said that the previous regime was incapable of actually taking benefits of globalization. So it's unfortunate, but I think the world has to go through this catharsis. There is no other alternative.
Two questions, we can take both of them together. Sure. Just be loud to use the microphone.
Yeah. Right. So I'm wondering, how is India's government going to be able to form a comprehensive and effective nationwide economic strategy
that deals with all the economic issues that you mentioned, given that it is so deeply federalized and there are so big differences in the economic strength of the different states, as well as economic ideology? I mean, you have some states that are bordering on communist. Well, I mean, it's a strong sense of communism in some states.
You see, the problem is, or the good part of it is that everyone in India recognizes that the alternative to not taking action now is going to be complete chaos. It's going to be a bloodbath. Because people will spill out on the street. There will be one section which will blame another section. You will have what we call the underclass, the so-called Dalits, who will blame the upper castes. You will have the Hindus who will blame the Muslims and vice versa. So it will be a mass, non-discriminatory bloodbath. Right? But I think all politicians are seized of that matter. And therefore, efforts at creating a common understanding on the next economic steps. We have done considerable journey forward on that path. So whether it is what you call communist states or whether it's right-wing states or anything else, they more or less have all agreed on some of the principles of what constitutes economic development. However, we have a remarkable ability to score a few own goals. Till now, the distribution of finances between the center and the state was based on 1971 baseline. So you knew that in 1971 the states got X amount of money, percentage from the taxes that they remitted to the center. And that was based on population. Now the central government wants to change it to 2000 and something. The problem is that then the southern states, which are the more developed states, are going to suffer significantly. Because they were more developed, they actually implemented what is called in India as a euphemism, is family planning. In other words, the more prosperous families did not have as many children. And unfortunately in India, the poorer you are, the more likely the families have to have multiple children, So if you change the baseline, the problem that arises is that the southern states will actually start getting less money because they were successful in controlling population. Whereas the northern states were, I don't want to use the word, but just jocularly, were irresponsible. So their population has grown. So in the division of the southern states contribute far more. They contribute more than 50% of the revenues, but they will end up getting about less than 30%. So this is a problem. So this is the kind of own goal. When everyone has agreed on certain principles, then the central government comes up with this scheme. So obviously the rest of the country is, at least the southern states, are all opposed to it. So you have one southern leader talk about creating, the Federation of South Indian States, kind of thing. This is all not going to happen, but it's a wake-up call, and so the central government has to start thinking a little bit more nimbly. But as I said, we are learning, and we can't afford not to learn. That is the problem.
Okay, to start with, in China now we see that some of the manufacturing jobs are moving towards South Asia at the time. And if, for example, something intensifies this trend, like a trade war with the US, has the things that Modi has put in place, could that attract those jobs to India instead of the other South Asian states? Or are there some fundamentals like land availability that will keep these other South Asian states more soaking up those jobs compared to India? And India should therefore rather focus on, for example, regional value chains. And a second part of that is the whole strategy, so to say, threatened by the whole strategy of attracting manufacturing for foreign markets threatened by automation decreasing the necessity for cheap labor?
One is, I think, India in any case will concentrate on creating regional value chains. Because as I mentioned earlier, India recognizes that unless its neighbors feel that they are invested in India's growth, this growth is not really going to occur unless they feel that they are also going to benefit. So that is one. Point two is that, yes, some of those jobs will migrate from China, but I don't think every single job will necessarily migrate to India. It would depend on where. For example, I don't think the textile industries would migrate to India. They would probably go to Thailand, Bangladesh, those areas. But if you look at low-end electronic manufacturing, that will probably migrate to India. You see, for already we are now the second largest producer of mobile phones. So these kind of things will happen, and the third problem, and that I think is something even our politicians are not grappling with, I don't think anywhere in the world they really understand it, is what is really AI and robotics going to do with the labor force? At the end of the day, the combination of artificial intelligence and robotics, I think, can replace several jobs and definitely can replace lawyers, but or maybe even journalists. I mean, given that there's so much fake news, a little bit more won't make a difference. But my point here is that how do you replace a psychoanalyst? Because a psychoanalyst requires empathy. A job that requires empathy is not something that AI can recreate, right? So you'll have to see how you can rework the nature of jobs that people will be doing. That is one. The second thing is, I think, and this is something you would love to, I think you should all look at. I think universal basic income will make a comeback, the whole concept. Because if you're going to have that many number of people who are going to be jobless, I mean, I think in India is going to be one of the first countries to implement that. Because that will be the solution to what you were suggesting. A single economic way of dealing with a huge number of problems. And if India provides, for example, a universal basic income, which this rural scheme is really trying to do, it will also significantly boost its internal production capacities because the demand will grow. So, I mean, I'm not certain that politicians across the world are fully seized of the problems that these disruptive technologies are going to create. But if they are, I'm very happy for them, but they're definitely not aware of the problems in India. That much I can say.
The microphone. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello. My first question would be about China pursuing naval bases in the Indian Ocean region. And that is obviously a strategy China is pursuing at the moment, but should India be worried about it, considering that during the boom years of China's development, US had many bases around around China's region. So should we pursue that kind of a strategy, keep your head down, as Deng Xiaoping said?
Military bases usually have the habit of moving around when there is something to protect. So if China has trade routes or China has significant investments in a particular area, which they feel could be threatened and require protection, they will have military bases. India can scream and jump and say what it wants about it. It's not going to stop it, right? That is point one. Point two is India's objection to anyone creating a base in the Indian Ocean is probably stems from the thought that the Indian Ocean is my lake and I don't want anyone else there, right? But if that is the case, then you have to be able to convince the rest of the world that you are able to provide security in your lake in a manner that does not impinge on the interests of others. And be it the Chinese or the US or anyone, if you're able to do that, they're not going to have a problem with it. But if you are going to start deciding that I will provide security but for these people but not for these, then you will have a problem. So India has to make up its mind. If it, as I say, you see, you have to decide, do you want to be a major power? Do you want to be at the global high table, or do you want to be an ally of another major power? That is the dilemma actually at the core of Indian foreign policy today. The Indian foreign policy maker has to decide that distinction. Because if he wants to be a major power, there is one path he has to pursue. If he wants to be an ally of another major power, there is a completely different path to pursue. Yeah.
Continuing on that, like, what do you think should be India's policy with regards to Iran, considering India's relationship with Israel has been growing in the military sector, and recently with Saudi Arabia, it is more visible, as I can say, and visibly the antagonism of Iran has also increased. So what should be India's policy in that sector?
India's engagement with Iran is multifaceted. It is not only about energy. Iran is India's outlet to Central Asia, Afghanistan. Iran, the North-South corridor, which has already been tested, and once it starts working, is India's access to Europe, apart from Russia itself. The North-South corridor can be complementary or adversarial. I mean, that depends on how it evolves towards the OBOR project. Because if the North-South corridor is successful, then a whole host of Southeast Asian countries would like to use it too. You see, because if it's cheaper and commercially gets their goods into Europe in 14 days, that's even faster than the Chinese route, right? So, given all these aspects, India cannot sacrifice its relationship with Iran. So, irrespective of how Iran's relationship evolves with the United States, I mean, I presume you're talking of the deal, if the United States pulls out or not, and whatever the tensions may exist between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, the point is, India will have to, show everyone that it is pursuing its economic interests, it's pursuing its national interest in its engagement with Iran. B, that is not detrimental to anyone. So there is no security or military aspect to its relationship with Iran. And that is particularly important even vis-a-vis, for example, our Pakistan policy. You know, there should not be a feeling that Chabahar will become militarized in counter to China's militarizing Gwadar, you see. But the third aspect is that people always ask about what India will do. But I think you should also look at it slightly differently, in the sense you should ask, what will Iran do? I mean, Iran may not want India there. Then what happens? So whatever India wants, it also depends on what Iranians want. You know, in India there is this saying, no, that when a farmer is asked by a chap who's doing a survey, a chap comes from town and starts walking in the jungle and doing a survey of farmers. And then casually he asks one farmer, there are tigers in your forest, and if you meet a tiger when you go for wood, what will you do? So the farmer looks at him and says, what are you asking me? I will do nothing. Whatever has to be done will be done by the tiger.
Yeah, one very last question, if somebody has that. Yeah, sure. Anyone besides you, if there is one? Otherwise, then you can take your chance, yeah.
Recently in the United States, there is talk of sanctions in the deals of the S-400 systems. I presume that was in relation with the deal with Turkey, but there's also a deal coming up with India. So what do you think will happen in that regard in the United States? And if there are no sanctions, what does that say about the India-Russia relationship and the India-United States relationship?
I think India will buy the S-400. I think the United States will not impose any sanctions. That should be an answer.
I guess my students of the class have already exhausted the questions, though they might be curious to listen quite more of that. But I'm keeping my tab that you have kind of taken a promise that I shouldn't kind of keep you as a hostage here. Thanks a lot, Mr. Unnikrisnan, because it was great to have you here. And as we discuss here, the sub-regionalism, the new regionalism, the idea of re-emergence of geoeconomics, which is playing along with the geopolitics, and multipolar world or multi-centric world, as you phrased it. That lecture of yours has basically also explained the operationalization part of the different public policy theories that we have seen being worked out inside India, inside its internal domestic policies as well as with its neighborhood. And thanks a lot, and can I just have the privilege to invite all of you to give a big round of applause to Mr. Nandan Unnikrisnan.
I must admit that I enjoyed the questions much more than the lecture.
You are the microscopic minority with your opinion, sir. And can I have the privilege to ask my student chamber members who have been all the time very active, and I will request them to come and provide you with a small token of thanks. We have a couple of small mementos to offer it to you. Sergey, would you like to kind of hand it over? And Lee, Maruk, please come. Malan, please come. And we would love to have a kind of a family picture with you at the end of that. So if it's right, yeah. It's okay. Can you just get the back?